So I'm aware that I am the last thing between you and lunch, we're all on this journey together, so I appreciate everyone's participation and patience with me today. This is testing in prod as part of the pyramid. If you'd like to grab these slides and follow along, you can feel free to scan the QR code on the screen. If you want to watch the presentation first, then decide if you want the slides or not, I won't hold that against you. I will be showing the QR code again at the end. But feel free to scan and follow along if you prefer to see it on your own screen as well. So to start, who here has ever pushed a bug into production? Let's see some hands, okay? So I see people who have and people who are lying. So now raise your hand if you pushed a bug into production even though all your tests passed. Okay, yeah, right. So some of you are just pushing even though your tests don't pass. Maybe don't do that. But the point here is that testing is supposed to give us confidence that our application is going to work as expected for our users. But that obviously does not always happen. Our tests are passed, but we still end up with bugs in production. So we have better and better tools out there for improving observability, debugging, and monitoring that allow us to deal with bugs when they happen rather than trying to prevent them in advance with testing, because they are bugs that get through, right? These tools are typically used by developers retroactively and reactively after the fact. So, for example, the last company that I worked at, a company called Replay, we had really great error monitoring alerts. And we spent a significant amount of time adding new categorizations in our source code whenever an unknown error occurred. That way we could better track them down the next time it happened. So sometimes we'd have a bug, we'd add the categorization, we'd tell the user, try it again. It's still not going to work, but at least now we'll have more information about why it's not working. But again, this is a very reactive after-the-fact type of approach. So how can we leverage these tools, but from a testing lens versus one of monitoring and debugging? So to do that, we're going to talk about testing in production. This is a quote from Charity Majors about some of the misconceptions around testing in production. Test in prod has become shorthand for all the irresponsible ways that we interact with production services or cut corners in our rush to ship. We all have seen like the memes of, I like to live dangerously, I test in prod, right? But the phrase seems to insinuate that you can only do one or the other. You either test before production or test in production. But that's a false dichotomy. All responsible teams perform both kinds of tests. So if testing at its core is about increasing confidence that our application is going to work as we expect it, then testing in production means applying those same quality principles that we use for testing pre-production to increase that confidence. Once we think about testing in production within that quality paradigm, or as part of the testing pyramid, so to speak, there's two major questions that emerge. The first is, how can we take a quality-focused approach to testing in production? The second is, how can we incorporate testing in production to our overall testing strategy? So there are two sides of the same coin where we're bringing quality concepts into prod, and then we're also taking the data that we learn from our production testing back into our overall quality strategy. So to help answer some of these questions, these are the things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-deployment testing in order to highlight some of the principles that you should be thinking about as you're developing your testing and production strategy. I'm also going to talk about some definitions around testing in production, talk about some of the tools that are available to help you do this, as well as some of the strategies and specific use cases that you may have for testing in production. So as far as I go, why am I here talking about this? Well, I'm Ceceila Martinez. You can follow me, find me on GitHub and Twitter at Ceceila Creates. In addition to my work in tech, I do a couple other things in the community. I volunteer with Women Who Code, and I'm also the head of the Atlanta chapter of Out in Tech, which supports the LGBTQ+ community in tech. So if you're interested in either of those things as well as testing, mobile DevOps, web development, feel free to connect with me and ask me questions about that. But I don't work for a feature flag or observability company. I'm not an SRE. I'm a developer advocate for AppFlow, which is a CI/CD platform for shipping mobile applications. But before that, I was at a company called Cypress, based in Atlanta, where I live. I was there for 2 years, and it's an open source framework for testing applications in the browser. I was about the 20th employee, pretty early in, wore a lot of different hats on the success team, and eventually was the first technical account manager there. That entailed working with our enterprise users to help them integrate Cypress into their CI/CD pipelines, and also work with them on their testing strategy. I would do what I call test strategy evaluation sessions, where I say, pull up your test code, pull up your workflows, let's take a look at it, I'll ask you some questions about your strategy, and we'll kind of jam on how we can make it better. So I spent a lot of time analyzing and seeing different real-world implementations of testing in production, or of real-world testing pipelines. And I will say also, just as a side note, if you ever feel like imposter syndrome about your test code, like, do not worry. I've seen it all. Like, you would think that like these big companies with all these developers and dedicated quality teams would have pristine test code, pristine test environments. It's very different in the real world. So as long as you're writing tests, that's a great first step. So through this, over time, I did start to see more teams start to incorporate testing in production tools. So I talked to teams, and they were like, we have these tools that we're using, and how can we incorporate that into our strategy? But they were usually using these tools from the developer perspective in a reactive debugging approach. So I wanted to better understand how we could apply those pre-deployment testing principles to what they were doing in production. So to start, let's start by looking at the types of testing available for traditional pre-deployment testing. Just to kind of get a read of the room, who here comes from a quality background or has done testing or has set up kind of testing strategies? Okay, so yeah, so it'll be new for some folks, but there's a lot of different testing paradigms, and all of these approaches that you can take to testing in pursuit of this like perfect unicorn, like perfect ratio of test types, right? Yeah, there's the testing trophy. How many of y'all have seen the testing trophy? A couple people. Okay, so this is from Kent C. Dodds. Basically, it's write tests, mostly integration, and it has this shape ratio of end-to-end integration, unit, and static testing. There's the testing crab by Gleb Bomatov. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this one, but this is essentially a large chunk of functional and visual end-to-end tests built on a base of component, unit, and API tests, covering different aspects of your system, trying to balance out speed and effectiveness. And then, of course, the classic testing pyramid, where you have a base of unit tests with integration and end-to-end tests built on top of that. But ultimately, the type of tests that you write will be based on the testing goals for your specific application, right? And that's what I found after doing all of these test strategy evaluation sessions and talking to testers, that nobody really likes the answer, it depends, right? But as in most things, when it comes to testing strategy, it really does depend on certain questions. It depends on what is the structure of your application, how do you deploy it, what does it do, what are your user and business goals, and what are your developer experience goals. For example, if you have complex business logic, then unit tests become very critical. You may have more of those. If UI and styling is paramount to the way that your application functions, you may incorporate visual testing. If you rely heavily on external systems or external APIs, you may have more contract testing. And of course, there's also API, component, and end-to-end testing for validating the functionality of the pieces of your web app, as well as how they work together, and that may be used across different implementations or systems. So whether you have a dedicated quality team or whether quality is primarily owned by developers at your organization, you've likely, hopefully, had a discussion on what types of testing that you're using, as well as what the coverage goals are for your testing. So by coverage goals, I'm talking about code coverage and test case coverage. It's important to have both of those, because you can have 100% code coverage and everything does not work. And so when we talk about what the goals are for the coverage of your application, we're talking about both of those. And again, you hopefully have a strategy in place for how you're maintaining tests, how you handle failures, and how you're creating and managing the environments, including the data that you're using for testing. So I talk about this to show that there isn't specifically one clear-cut strategy for testing pre-deployment And the same applies for testing in production. However, there are certain things that you will take into consideration as you're developing your strategy, specifically what your goals are, and from there, building out the types of testing that you're going to use, what your goals are, and how you're going to maintain and the tests that you have. All right, so let's actually get into testing in production. So testing in production is not meant to replace testing that takes place pre-deployment. Please still write tests. You know, like the quote said, all responsible teams perform both kinds of tests. It's a false dichotomy. You don't need to do one or the other, you do both. So how does testing in production fit into that overall strategy? Well, let's start with some definitions. This is one from Optimizely. So testing in production is a software development practice in which new code changes are tested on live user traffic rather than in a staging environment. It is one of the testing practices found in continuous delivery. I also wanted to note, you may see the term progressive delivery instead of continuous delivery. Progressive delivery is focused on the shipping of features with a greater shift to testing in production. So you're not necessarily thinking in terms of releases where you're saying whatever changes that we have available, whatever code is ready to go, we ship that out as a release. Instead, it is focused more on features. And features are rolled out or rolled back independently, using something like feature flags based on results of the testing in production. So this represents kind of the frontier of delivering to users quickly and efficiently, but also responsively, and being responsive to what you find from testing in production. And there's definitely some benefits to testing in production. The one that I think speaks to a lot of people, the one that kind of people mention first, is the greater environmental accuracy. There are a lot of pain points when it comes to replicating production environments for testing. How many of y'all have tried to create ephemeral test environments that match the same as production? And yeah, so I feel your pain. At Cypress, I did an actual 2-hour workshop just on test data management. Like that alone, 2 hours talking about how to manage your test data and set up those environments. So even when you have test environments that are really focused on having high fidelity, there are inevitably things that you're going to need to mock out, right? So greater environmental accuracy is one of the things that is a good benefit of being able to test in production. The other is, if you're set up to test in production with the right tools and strategies in place, with the right tools and strategies in place, then you can have more control over your deployments. You have deployment agility so that you can feel more confident in your ability to deploy either your entire code base, specific changes, or roll back as needed. You also get more nuanced testing information. So in Sarah's talk earlier about observability versus monitoring, you talked about kind of what are the things that we don't know. So testing, when we have it pre-deployment, we're constructing that world for ourselves. Testing is based on the arrange, act, assert model, right? So you set up your test, you do something, and you write an assertion, did something happen or not? Was it true or false? Did the test pass or not? With testing in production, we get data from a wider range of sources that we are then able to interpret and utilize to bring back into our quality strategy. So we're dealing with a real world, not something that we have constructed. There are also obviously some limitations when you talk about testing in production. It does require you to have modern deployment set up. You have to have that agility in order to be able to do testing in production so that you can construct and control things if things don't necessarily work out the way they're supposed to. You also need to have a strategy in place for your data and security management, making sure that you're leveraging the right types of data and the right types of accounts, and you're not impeding on anything that is happening in production that should not be. This requires some forethought in terms of what your goals are and how you're going to interact with your production data. There's also, the potential for outages or bugs related to implementation. These are things that can go wrong that are not the result of your code or your application itself. We see this in testing pre-deployment, right? Like a test fails, and the first question is, was it the code base? Was it the test code? Was it the test environment? Do we just need to rerun it again and hope that it passes this time? So that carries over to production as well. You could have things go wrong, and it has nothing to do with your app itself, but rather how you've implemented your testing and production system. So having really great monitoring observability and leveraging those tools to get a clearer picture of what has gone wrong will be important as well. I did want to make a quick note that for this session, I'm focusing on application quality testing because, to be honest, that's what I know the most about. And there are other types of testing that fall under the umbrella of like testing in prod. We'll probably hear some great talks today and tomorrow about some of these topics, but that includes performance testing, security testing, stress testing, and recovery testing. These are focused more on the systems that you have in place in order to distribute your application versus the application quality itself. So, all right, so let's talk about the tools available for testing in production. I have mentioned feature flags a couple times. These are available. You can either build them out yourself with configuration or like just simply just Booleans in your code. There's also tooling that you can use to get these set up. They're also called toggles or switches, and they turn functionality on and off in production without deploying new code. How many people have feature flags in their system set up? Okay, yeah, some. And these are something where you can introduce it like with one thing, or you could have them spread throughout your entire code base. Sometimes they're spread throughout your entire code base because you forgot to remove them, and they're still there. So this is used for graduated rollouts, where you are essentially incrementally increasing the number of users that have access to a feature, or for split testing, where you're testing different versions of a feature implementation. It can also serve as a kill switch for when things go wrong, right? If you need to roll back quickly, you can just update the feature flag and you don't have to do a deployment. So it separates deployments from releases. So you can deploy code, but you release features using something like a feature flag. Then there are monitoring and observability tools. Again, monitoring and observability tools are tools that are used for monitoring for observability, but then can be leveraged for testing in production. So monitoring is about gathering predefined metrics or logs, so that's focused on what we know. And observability is about exploring finding things that are not defined in advance, so things that we don't know. Again, Sarah covered a lot of this earlier with much more nuance and detail. And so these are reliability tools that can be used for testing in production as part of the strategy there, even though they're primarily more about observability and debugging and performance. And finally, there's some other tools that you may not think of as testing tools. However, when you approach testing in production with this quality perspective, these can come into play. The first is product usage analytics. There's a lot of options here, but essentially these are quantitative metrics of how your user is interacting with your application. So things like feature usage, page visits, time on page, anything that you would want to track. You can leverage that as part of your testing and production strategy to see how users are actually interacting with features quantitatively. You can also get qualitative data from tools that are like session replay tools. These actually record a user session remotely, which then you can then play back. These are things like LogRocket, Full Story, Crazy Egg. I've used all three of those. But that allows you to get qualitative data around, how long does your user wait before clicking a button? Like, do they get confused about the certain user interface that's taking place? And then you also have qualitative data collection around things like satisfaction surveys, support tickets, user feedback, things that you can then take into consideration as you're evaluating your test. So how can we use these tools together for an effective testing and production strategy? So it's important to remember that testing in prod is still testing. Focus on that testing aspect. We design a testing strategy based on, again, I said, the architecture of our application, how we deploy it, and our goals for testing. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So there's going to be different approaches that you can take based on what those goals are. So we're going to look at some potential scenarios and how you could implement a testing and prod strategy for each of these. For each scenario, we'll talk about what the scenario, how do we define it, talk about what tools will be used, and some of the requirements for that approach. The first is feature experimentation. This is when you're evaluating features, an aspect of a feature, or how to implement a specific feature. This is typically what we call split testing with feature flags. This will require investment specifically in product usage analytics. So if you don't have good product usage analytics set up and you deploy an A/B test using feature flags, you're not going to be able to get helpful data about how that test has actually gone. Again, the product usage analytics provide things like how people are using that feature quantitatively. You will also need to have very strict definitions of success and test conclusion criteria. This is an experiment. You need a hypothesis. You need a definition of success. You need to know what being done looks like and what results look like. So, for example, I asked earlier, I mentioned having feature flags that are still out there. How many people know for a fact that they have feature flags in their code base that they no longer leverage or have been turned on forever? Okay, a couple people, yeah. So one thing that I see too is starting an experiment without knowing what it is that you're hoping to accomplish with that. So having very specific criteria for how many, whether it's time-based, whether it's traffic-based, whether it is we have a certain number of data points that we can then analyze in order to make a decision on how we'd like to move forward. So feature experimentation is specific in that it should have a start and an end with defined criteria. The next is production uncertainty. So this is where you have a production environment that's really difficult to reproduce for testing, and you are worried about deploying new changes and how that's going to go. So this is if you have, for example, really complex external services, if you have a really complex data model that's difficult to create a test data bed for testing, and you make changes to that data model. You could have complex containerization or deployments, again, that are difficult to reproduce in a test environment. So the last company I was at, Replay, we had a very complex deployment strategy, or a back end really, that required us to spin up multiple containers, and then within those containers run hundreds of browsers that would replay a recording of a browser session using code. That would then connect to the front end of the application in order to render what was being replayed in the browser. So it's kind of like a Monte Carlo simulation with browsers and containers every single time somebody uses the web app. So that's really, really hard to reproduce. It's intensive. And so that's why we had those really specific monitoring events defined in advance, so that every time we pushed out a change, we right away could see what was pinging, and we had a strong strategy for being able to roll back. So this is where we talk about not necessarily split testing, but graduated rollouts. And graduated rollouts, you'll still kind of use feature flags, but use a different function of feature flags where you're only exposing that change to a percentage of your users at a given time. And then that's to minimize the blast radius, essentially, to prevent that from affecting as many people as possible. We even see this now in mobile development, where you can do phased releases of your mobile applications so that only certain users are getting it, and then once you feel comfortable, you expand that out. You will definitely need to have investment in monitoring with events that have been defined in advance, specifically for high-risk areas of your application. So what I would call the money line, or the money path, where if it breaks, you're not making any money and everything is bad, as well as new areas that could be considered high risk. And you also need to have strict approval criteria for how you're expanding to impacted users. Again, that could be time-based, it could be traffic-based, it could be, it's been 20 minutes with zero incidents, but having that defined rollback and recovery plan is really critical. One time, prod went down and I was in the middle of a live stream about to do a demo, and I'm discording them hey, it's not loading. And 3 minutes later, it was back up, and I was able to continue on with my live stream. So having that mature deployment strategy for these types of being able to roll back is really important when you have production uncertainty. Next is usability. This is a different use case. This is specifically for product and UX validation. So how are your users interacting with your new feature? This isn't feature experimentation where you're necessarily having different implementations of the same feature, but this is validating, like, is this feature something that we're going to move forward with or not? So you're still going to use split testing, but instead of having different implementations, it's going to be more like a Boolean, like a yes or a no. For this, you'll want to invest in session replay and qualitative data collection. So this is something where if you've ever done like user testing with Figma mocks, to say like, how will we click through this? You can do this, but you can do it in production. And so you're going to want to really see how your user interacts with your product in order to validate how you'd like to move forward with that. And then the last one is experimental. So this is to help you identify unknowns when you have a complex change and you're not sure what you don't know yet. So this could be things like you're doing an API migration, you have an architectural change, you're making a tech stack change, maybe updating some dependencies, or you have a brand new feature. Typically, this change has been well tested, but you're not confident that all test cases have been identified. This will also be a graduated rollout, but again, separate from the production uncertainty graduated rollout, this is based more on identifying potential unknowns. Production uncertainty graduated rollouts are based on reliability with defined events. Experimental graduated rollouts are going to be based more on observability to identify those unknowns. And so you're going to want to make sure that you have invested in observability and your system is set up for that. You typically also will do this with cohorts of user types. So it may not be just a rough percentage based, but because you're trying to identify and isolate things that you don't know, reducing the number of variables that you have can be helpful here. So if you have certain user types or different cohorts that may have different types of interactions with your application, doing graduated rollouts to different cohorts can be helpful here in just identifying the things that you may not know. And so being able to identify those patterns can be particularly helpful there. Whatever approach that you take, just make sure that it's intentional. Again, we're taking that quality approach, testing in prod. Experiment with intentional testing based on one specific goal to start. So if one of those use cases that we just went through applies to your organization, you can pick something like that, or you can start with something else. But testing in production can be a really valuable part of your overall testing strategy because of those benefits we talked about. They're real users in a real production environment, and that's something that you can't really replicate. So yeah, I have some resources here, things that you can kind of use to get started and cover some of the topics that we talked about today. And you can grab all these links from the slide. Again, you can scan the QR code there, and feel free to find me again at Ceceila Creates. Thank you all so much.